It was late in October in the early 1920s, and Mrs. S.B. Matthews was scheduled to attend a special get-together for the weekend. Her mother had had a nightmare and didn't want her to go. Perhaps it would have been better if she hadn't. Go back as Mrs. Matthews remembers, "Heavy hangs over my head."
Almost everything that happens can be explained in one way or another, either through natural or scientific means. The experience I'm about to relate does not belong in either category. The years which have elapsed in no way have dimmed or distorted the incident. I have only to close my eyes. It is yesterday, and I'm 14. The time was in the early 20s, and our family lived on a farm at the edge of a small rural Alabama town. We loved the country, as did all the families around us. It was a good life, although there was no organized recreation for young people. We enjoyed visiting back and forth with our neighbors and friends on weekends, each visit being looked upon as a privilege as well as an adventure. I was particularly interested in being invited to the homes of friends who had teenage brothers to help make the time more enjoyable. On that weekend, late in October, the harvest was in full swing, the hay sweet and fresh smelling, the moon full, and the air bracing. I had been invited with my best friend to spend the weekend with her cousin who lived over the river. A trip over the river was looked upon with special social approval by the younger set. Very few had the opportunity to travel many miles from home, so crossing the river bridge was like going into another state. Parents in those days did not easily give their consent for girls under 16 to be away from home overnight. However, after many promises and much persuasion, ours finally gave theirs. We were transported with happiness as we enthusiastically made preparation and looked forward to Friday afternoon. Each recess and lunch found us together discussing our upcoming activities with great anticipation. On Friday morning at breakfast, my spirits approached the zero level when my mother flatly announced that she had changed her mind about the intended visit and that after school I was to return home. The other members of the family looked at me sympathetically but were too astonished to make a comment. After much wheedling and many tears as to the reason for this decision, she confessed that she had a dream last night. No amount of cajoling or persuasion could prevail on her to tell her dream. My father, practical-minded and very much the extrovert, teased her so mercilessly she became slightly huffed and said, "Well, go on then." But her expression showed she was utterly miserable. I was most curious about the dream and somewhat disturbed. My Irish ancestry rose to the fore, cautioning me that dreams were not to be ignored or treated lightly. The fear that Mama would again change her mind caused me to gather up my belongings in haste to depart for school. She followed me to the door and looked at me so sadly I decided not to go. Before I could tell her so, a call from inside demanded her attention and she disappeared through the door. The hours dragged by, and at last it was 4 o'clock and we were on our way. The surrey, hitched to 2 horses of ancient vintage and driven by the brother of our hostess, approached the long wooden bridge over the river. This bridge was an awesome contraption which rattled and shook with every revolution of the surrey wheels. Having been condemned many years before as being unsafe, tended to make the ride across a daring and frightening exploit. As we rolled off the bridge on the other side, my relief knew no bounds. After riding for some time down the main road, we turned into a swampy country road which led to my friend's house a mile away. As we rode into the swamp, a chill ran down my spine. I suddenly felt a presence I could not account for. A feeling that something was about to happen engulfed me as we rode on. The dark shadows cast by the overhanging trees and the dark depths of the cypress swamp added to my uneasiness. A hidden danger seemed to lurk in the occasional small streams and water pockets in the road. The roughness of the road hindered the progress of the surrey, so the sun was going down by the time we emerged from the swamp. It was a huge red ball fast disappearing over another dark forest. The reflection gave a weird cast to the landscape, making everything seem very unreal. At last we were riding into the farmyard. Through the open front door of the house, we could see a cheerful oak fire burning in the fireplace. There was the familiar sound of farm animals having their evening meal, and for the moment I felt reassured. A big wagon loaded with hay stood waiting for the hayride, which had been the topic of conversation for days. A hayride under the harvest moon, what could be more thrilling and exciting? My spirits rose. The sun was gone now, and we were in the warm, cozy kitchen, having a supper of country ham and gravy, hot biscuits, and fig preserves. I felt much better, and had almost forgotten my premonition of the afternoon. As soon as we had finished supper, we found a dozen or more young folks from neighboring farms awaiting us in the barnyard. We piled into the hay-laden wagon drawn by 2 large gray mules. My friend's 17-year-old brother climbed into the driver's seat, and we were off. Since it was near Halloween, it was decided to take the spooky route through Cypress Swamp that we had traveled that afternoon. As this decision was made, my heart sank to the bottom of my button-up boots, and all the forebodings of the afternoon returned. As we neared the swamp, I became almost terror-stricken. Feeling such fear was a new experience for me, and that in itself was very upsetting. I gradually worked my way to the center of the wagon, pretending I was cold. By this time, we were well into the swamp again. Everyone was talking, laughing, and telling ghost stories, when suddenly some small animal ran across the road in front of us. The frightened mules veered into the side of the road, pulling the wagon under the low, overhanging branches of a large water oak. The branches swept over the wagon and somehow became entangled in my waist-length curls. The mules started running, and I was forcibly jerked from the wagon. As I dangled from the branches by my hair, I must have lost consciousness. The next thing I recall, 2 people were holding me up, and our driver was cutting my curls loose from the branches with his pocket knife. The girls were weeping, saying, "Her neck is broken. She's dead." So shaken was I that I do not remember the trip back, nor anything else until I was being helped into bed. Declaring I was all right, I would not consent to being carried home. During the night I seemed to be floating in a sea of pain. By morning I could not turn my head nor bear for anyone to touch my hair, which was in a sad state of tangles with huge gaps where the hair had been cut away. It was decided that I had best go home, so the Model T was brought out, and the journey back to town started. The driver of the night before stopped in the road by the oak and showed me locks of my hair which were still hanging in the branches. I had no desire to rehash the experience of the night before, and quickly urged him to drive on. As we rode along, I occupied myself with the thoughts of how I could explain this disaster to my parents, but the problem was still unsolved when the car pulled up in the yard. Before the car had stopped, my mother was there with a questioning look in her eyes. Seeing me on my feet apparently reassured her. A cap hid the missing curls, though my general appearance must have left much to be desired. She still seemed apprehensive as we walked into the house. I tried to divert her thoughts by making small talk, saying I was homesick and needed to study for Monday's Latin test. The car was coming into town anyway, so I just decided to come along. Gradually she began to relax. "By the way, Mama," I said, "you never did tell me your dream and why you wanted me to stay home." "Well," she said, smiling a little self-consciously, "I guess your dad was right. I am superstitious and silly to worry about dreams, but I will tell you now. I dreamed that I was walking through a dark swamp and came upon you hanging in a tree by your hair, and you had been dead for a long time."
When it came to Halloween, or any time for that matter, there was nothing spookier or creepier than the old-time horror programs on the radio. John Dinan remembers them well and relates when the ghostly waves of the air kept you up late in the days of radio horrors.
One of the pleasures of growing up with radio was listening to the great horror programs of the 1930s and 1940s. Curled up in our chairs, we waited anxiously for the top of the hour, when spooky music told us that one of these shows was about to begin. The only light in the room was the yellow glow of the radio dial. No talking or other noise was tolerated, as the announcer warned us about what we would hear.
Good evening, friends. This is your host to welcome you again through the creaking door into the inner sanctum. Come in, come in. I'm enjoying some winter sports with a couple of cold-blooded skates. Personally, I don't mind the low temperature anymore. That's because I wear a snowfall storm coat. Keeps the cold spirits out. Yes, now I'm just a werewolf in a sheepskin-lined shroud. Oh, him? That's our photographer, Artie. Yes, he just passed out while taking a picture from overexposure.
Then Raymond took us into the weird and threatening world of our imagination for a half hour that we would talk about with our friends until the next week's program. The creative sound effects were vital to the story, and they filled us with a sense of dread. During one chilling broadcast, the sound effects crew smashed a melon with a hammer to represent a head being bashed in. Spine-tingling doom chords from a Hammond organ in the radio studio further enhanced the black mood. Finally, at the story's end, Raymond would step over the bloody corpses as the squeaking door closed tight until next time. We turned on the lights and headed off to bed, with visions of Raymond's inner sanctum swirling in our heads. We listened to other horror stories too, including The Hermit's Cave, Lights Out, Stay Tuned for Terror, Suspense, and The Witch's Tale. Each Witch's Tale broadcast began with the witch, Nancy, talking to her cat, Satan. 109-year-old I be today, yes, sir. 109-year-old. Well, Satan, we got a scientific bedtime story to tell these folks tonight. The cat mused. You said it, Satan. When it comes to science, me and you knows more than them who makes a living at it. Douse out them lights and we'll get right to business. Now draw up to the fire and gaze into the embers. Gaze into 'em deep, and soon you'll see a big, fine office in a fine, tall building down in New York City. And that begins our yarn about the mirror. The cat mused. Each of the witches' tales ended with an epilogue from Nancy. Pleasant nightmares. She always promised another such tale come next week. Same time, same station. Back in those golden days of radio, it was easy to suspend reality and submerge ourselves in the moody dramas. We hadn't been jaded by over-the-top special effects, the kind that are used today to jazz up even the most ordinary films. No, back then, letting ourselves get involved was the fun of it all. We gave our imaginations free rein to run with the storyline. Dazzling special effects hadn't dried up our imaginative juices, and it was more fun to let our imaginations run wild.
I have a little quiz for you. Here are 6 musical introductions to suspense and action programs on the radio back in the good old days. See how many of them you can name. How many did you get? The first was Lights Out. The second was Suspense, followed by Flash Gordon, Escape, The Green Hornet, and finally, The Shadow. While we're on the subject of scary old-time radio, how can we forget the October 30th, 1938 broadcast of The War of the Worlds on CBS? Although it had disclaimers at the start of the show, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater actors set in motion a panic that electrified the nation. The program was the 17th in a series of dramatizations of classic works of literature, and Welles had chosen H.G. Wells' classic tale of Martians attacking the Earth as an eve of Halloween treat for listeners. The CBS switchboard was deluged with calls as folks tuning in late caught just the realistic broadcast of news clips and panicked. Elizabeth Cluff was a 13-year-old when The War of the Worlds was broadcast. Complete with cuts from the original program, here are her memories of the night Mars attacked.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's, and yet as mortal as his own. We know now that as human beings busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water.
The other day, while enjoying a leisurely browse through the local bookshop, I saw a tape entitled War of the Worlds. It sent my mind whirling into the past. Here was Orson Welles' fantastic radio broadcast, preserved for this generation. But no one could ever preserve on tape the feelings I experienced when I first heard it, or the lesson I learned from the whole incredible experience. It was 1938. The United States was still submerged in a Great Depression. In Europe, the boots of Hitler's armies were heard marching in the Rhineland, grinding toward Austria. The vibrations of a pending world disaster were starting to be felt around the world. Our own hometown newspaper carried foreboding predictions of the certainty of war. But my world, the world of an impressionable, happy 13-year-old growing up in Johnson City, New York, was vastly different. I was unaware of the bleak depression. My biggest problems were earning the 25 cents I needed for the Saturday movie, and making sure I had dry socks. I owned only one pair of white cotton socks, and I washed them out in the kitchen sink each evening, hoping they would be dry by the time I put them on again the next morning. Otherwise, the horror of putting on wet socks would dampen my whole day. A pair of soft, new ones was a heartwarming treat, because my mother would darn a hole as big as one of her jelly tarts in my old ones. How I hated the stiffness and roughness of those darn socks. But even in those awful scratchy socks, I felt life was pretty darn wonderful. I was oblivious to the tension that had made our nation vulnerable to mass panic. In those days, radio was our national pastime. It was not only our major means of entertainment, but offered an immediate and dependable vehicle for important news broadcasts. It was October 30th, 1938. My mother and father and I had gone into the living room after Sunday evening supper. The radio filled the room with soft music. An announcer nonchalantly said, "The program you are listening to is music by Ramon Raquello and his orchestra, being broadcast from the Meridian Room in the Hotel Park Plaza in downtown New York." I sprawled on the patterned rug. My mother, sitting in a big upholstered armchair next to me, was mending those white cotton socks. I watched her fingers, so quick and agile with the darning needle. As the thread moved in and out, in and out, in and out, the hole she was mending started to disappear. I felt warm and hypnotized as I listened to the lovely music from the radio. Suddenly, the music stopped abruptly. An announcer, his voice tense and anxious, broke in.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Ramon Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
And now a tune that never loses favor, the ever-popular Stardust, Raymond Raquello and his orchestra.
Other announcements followed so rapidly that I could hardly grasp them. The announcer shouted, "A meteor has landed near Grover's Mill, New Jersey, just 22 miles from Trenton. 1,500 people have been killed already. No, it isn't a meteor. It's a spaceship from Mars." We hardly stopped to breathe as he bellowed, "They have come to wage war against the people living on Earth. The Martian creatures keep emerging. They are armed with death rays. Keep back, keep back. Keep those idiots back. The state of New Jersey has declared martial law." I was on my feet now, and my father sat on the edge of his chair, puffing his cigar rapidly. The announcer was saying, "People are dropping like flies." I was startled. "Is it true?" I asked my mother. Without looking up, she quietly answered, "It must be true. It's on the news." Her fingers continued to move the needle steadily, in and out, with skillful precision. The voice on the radio continued, alarmed. "The hideous monsters are armed with death rays. There is no escape from this disaster. It is the opinion of many that this invasion means the end of the world." Terrified, I asked, "Are we going to die?" She knew no more about the grotesque report than I did, but her voice was calm. "If we're going to die, we're going to die." Then she looked into my frightened eyes and said, "Why don't we just wait quietly and see what this is all about?" For 10 more harrowing minutes, my mother mended away as we listened to professors from Princeton and officials in Washington comment on the situation. Then an announcer calmly said, "You are listening to a CBS presentation of Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater of the Air in an original dramatization of War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The performance will continue after a brief intermission. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System." I was so relieved. My dad sat back and relaxed in his chair, and I sprawled once more on the living room rug to enjoy the rest of the broadcast. I went to bed, thinking the whole thing had been scary but exciting. It was the next day before I learned about the panic the broadcast had caused. It was the talk of the school. It was the talk of the town. It was the talk of the nation and the world. Newspaper headlines shouted, "Tidal wave of terror sweeps nation." Our own Binghamton Press headlines for October 31st, 1938 read, "War of the Worlds Panic Starts Probe," and "Fantastic News Broadcast Causes Hysteria Over Nation." It was a panic of national proportions. Overcome by hysteria, millions of people had tried to flee from the Martians before they waited to learn the truth. For nearly 2 weeks, newspapers carried human interest stories about people's terrified reactions to the broadcast. No, I don't need to buy a tape of War of the Worlds to remember the night the Martians invaded Earth. I will never forget it, or the cloud of dread that had enveloped me for those few terrifying minutes. But the experience taught me a lesson, too. To this day, whenever I feel fear loom up within me, I hear a voice from somewhere saying, "Why don't we just wait quietly and see what it is all about?" And I can see Mother's needle moving, in and out, in and out, in and out.
This is Orson Welles, ladies and gentlemen, out of character, to assure you that the War of the Worlds has no further significance than as the holiday offering it was intended to be. The Mercury Theater's own radio version of dressing up in a sheet and jumping out of a bush and saying boo. Starting now, we couldn't soap all your windows and steal all your garden gates by tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS. You will be relieved, I hope, to learn that we didn't mean it and that both institutions are still open for business. So goodbye, everybody, and remember, please, for the next day or so, the terrible lesson you learned tonight. That grinning, glowing, globular invader of your living room is an inhabitant of the pumpkin patch, and if your doorbell rings and nobody's there, that was no Martian. It's Halloween.
Tonight, the Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations coast to coast has brought you The War of the World by H.G. Wells, the 17th in its weekly series of dramatic broadcasts featuring Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater on the air. Next week, we present a dramatization of 3 famous short stories. This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.